Hello everybody, Jeremy Dickinson here. Thank you all for watching. So in this video what I want to talk about is human moral status. And so what I want to do is introduce the topic and then turn my discussion to Matthew Liao's 2008 essay, which I have here in my hand, The Basis of Human Moral Status. So what I'll do is I'll talk about Liao's view and I'll talk about some of the key moves that he makes in that paper. But let's go ahead and begin by just introducing the topic. So human moral status. I think we can get at thinking about human moral status first by just thinking about how it is that we think that there are constraints on the ways that human beings can be treated. So we tend to think that you do something wrong to someone if you lied to them, all things being equal. We tend to think that you do wrong to someone if you were to steal from them, or if you were, worse yet, kill them. So there seem to be certain constraints on the kinds of things that we can do to human beings. And it seems like an initially plausible, commonplace explanation for these constraints on how we can treat human beings is going to be found in thinking about human moral status. Okay? We tend to think that human beings have a moral status that rules out our treating human beings in the way that I've noted in the previous examples. Moreover, if a human being is in need, if a human being needs help, perhaps the clearest cases is when people need serious help. They're really, really hungry. They don't have a place to live. They don't have basic medical attention, etc., etc. We tend to think that we need to confer positive benefits on them. We need to help them. We tend to think that we have an obligation to help other people when they're in need. The degree to which we have to is an open philosophical issue, as you can imagine. But it's in virtue of human beings occupying, or having, perhaps better, a moral status. And that moral status is the kind of thing that makes it the case that we have obligations to positively benefit human beings when they're in need. So I think it'd be very natural to explain why it is that we think that we should help other people when they're in need in terms of just the moral status that human beings have. So I don't take that to be very controversial. What's controversial is going to be what is it that accounts for the fact that human beings have moral status in the first place. As you can imagine, there's different views out there, conflicting views out there. So one such view, and this is perhaps the view that jumps to your mind most immediately, would be plausible if it did, is the fact that human beings are rational. So there's been a long-standing view in the history of philosophy, perhaps in the history of just human thinking, that our rational abilities, our advanced rational abilities, compared to our fellow earthlings, animals, is what accounts for our moral status. We have rationality levels that are unparalleled when it comes to comparing them to other life forms on this planet. Again, animals being the clear comparison class here. And the thought is rationality might be the thing. Advanced levels of rationality, perhaps, because you might say that animals, at least some of them, have rationality of a certain kind, certain weak kind, but human beings have advanced levels of rationality, and that's the thing that confers moral status on us. Now, keep in mind, we could also think about a moral status, or we could think about the issue of moral status as providing us with a clue, if we arrive at an answer, to why it is that we think that we can treat animals in certain ways that we wouldn't dream of treating human beings in. Okay, so that's just food for thought, thinking about the issue. So rationality seems, advanced levels of rationality perhaps, seem to be the thing that we can lock in on initially for accounting for the difference in moral status between animals and humans, or to be the thing just more generally that accounts for our moral status. There's a very standard objection to this view, which might be initially surprising, given that rationality just seems to be the thing that human beings have that would account for their moral status. And it's that, look, it seems like some human beings are disadvantaged in such a way that they lack the rationality levels. Perhaps they're born with severe brain defects, and the brain defects lead to significant cognitive impairment such that the rationality levels are severely compromised. Perhaps some human beings are going to have then rationality levels on a par with animals, animals that we find, that we raise for food, etc. Okay. Now, the issue of whether or not we're doing something correct by raising animals for food, that's for another day. That's another video, and I do have videos on those if you're interested. But I'm not trying to plug anything there. It would seem to follow then that these human beings, these beings that we would consider our kin, they don't have the moral status, because they lack the relevant property that was claimed establishes our moral status. So it would be nice if we had a view that didn't rule out some human beings, some of us, as having significant moral status. So rationality, as it were, it seems like it's an initially plausible starting point. All by itself, it doesn't seem like it's going to work. Some might say, well, it's by belonging to a biological group, in this case the group Homo sapiens, that confers moral status on those who lack advanced levels of rationality. So if you belong to a biological group whose members typically display advanced levels of rationality, for example, then it might be claimed that that's what's going to confer moral status on even those among us who lack rationality or lack having advanced levels of rationality. And that's one way that some could go. Keep in mind, Liao actually addresses this in his paper, so I haven't got to Liao yet in the way that I wanted to, but I can go ahead and reveal what he would say in response to that kind of view. And his response is just going to be, look, there's been a philosopher named Jeff McMahon who's developed the case of the super chimp. So imagine a super chimp ends up having advanced levels of rationality. It's just a rare, one-of-a-kind kind of chimp. So the super chimp is going to be a rare chimp in terms of its rational abilities. It looks like this view where we tried to expand this notion of rationality to account for human beings that lack advanced levels of rationality. When we use that same kind of reasoning and apply it to the case of super chimp, the super chimp is not going to be conferred the significant moral status that it should be conferred. So it looks like we got the wrong result. Why are we going to get the wrong result? Because it's going to look like the chimp belongs to a species, right, whose members don't typically have advanced levels of rationality. So going this more expanded route and thinking about rationality isn't going to save thinking about rationality, right, as a thing that establishes a human moral status. Okay, so that's all by way of introduction. What is Liao's view? Okay, it's not going to be the rationality view, though Liao can say that rationality is the kind of thing that can confer a moral status on us. His view is the following. So you can find this on page 7. I'm just going to read his view. He writes, "My proposal is as follows. All human beings are right holders, think about moral right holders, because they all have the genetic basis for moral agency. And it seems that having this genetic basis is sufficient, unnecessary, for one to be a right holder, a moral right holder." Okay, the sufficiency point here is important because there could be other properties that beings have that confers on them moral status. So you needn't be so exclusive. So this is a sufficiency claim. It's sufficient that if you have the genetic basis for moral agency, then you're a moral right holder. Okay. So what is the genetic basis for moral agency? See if I can say a couple things about that. So it's a genetic account, ultimately. So beings like you and I, perhaps all beings like you and I, so note his claim is all human beings are right holders in virtue of this sufficiency, this sufficient condition being established. So we have the genetic makeup. We have a genome which has a genetic basis for morality built into it, right? So part of our genome is going to encode for, if I can put it that way, moral agency. So there's at least some basis for our moral agency found, guess what, in our genes. It doesn't have to be entirely our moral agency needn't be entirely determined by what's going on genetically, but all Liao needs is that it partially does so. Okay, So here's what it means to be a moral agent, if that idea isn't clear to you yet. So Liao, he follows Carl Wellman on this, and he notes, following Carl Wellman and others, I take moral agency to be the capacity to act in light of moral reasons. Okay, so moral agency means that one can act for moral reasons. Certainly you and I can act for moral reasons. So it could be a moral reason, not to lie to someone, not to steal from someone, not to kill from someone. Certainly we can act on the basis of those moral reasons. Now, this view is not saying that we actually have to have the moral agency. It's having the genetic basis for it. So then you could see, even if there are those among us who don't actually exercise moral agency, they still have the genetic basis for it. So even those who are, for example, severely mentally disabled, for whatever reason, they could end up having the genetic basis for moral agency. In fact, Liao is going to claim that they do. And we have good reasons for thinking that they do anyways. So he wants to make this universal claim, namely that this applies to all human beings. Okay. Now, if some among us, as it were, lack the genetic basis for moral agency, Liao says it's an open question as to whether or not those are going to count as human beings. Okay, but he does think this is really crucial, that we have reason to think that just about every being that we recognize as a human being is going to have the genetic basis for moral agency. Okay, so he notes on page 10, so we've got his view, hopefully. He says on page 10, how do we know that all human beings have the genetic basis for moral agency? And here's what he notes. We know that all normal functioning human beings, and those at the beginning of life, infants, young children, fetuses, who will develop normally, have this genetic basis. If they didn't, then they wouldn't then later act morally. Since they exercise moral agency or will exercise it, so I'm continuing with Liao on page 10 here, and after conception, the genetic codes of a human being do not change very much, if at all. We also know that most comatose human beings have this genetic basis because they have exercised moral agency. Okay, they have it because we know they have it because they've used it. It's just that they were in a comatose state due to some unfortunate circumstances that occurred after they exercised moral agency. Most cases of anencephaly, so cases where fetuses, babies are born with undeveloped brains, incomplete brains, are not genetic but caused by environmental factors, such as folic acid deficiency. So we can assume that many of those with anencephaly also have this genetic basis. Moreover, those with mild mental disability, he uses a word here I don't like to use, the R word. I don't like to use that, so I'll use mental disability, such as children with Down syndrome, typically exhibit some moral agency. This suggests that they also have the genetic basis for moral agency. So he goes on to give other reasons, but it looks like those among us who are significantly mentally handicapped, disabled, etc., they're going to have the genetic basis for moral agency. Accordingly, they are moral rights holders on Liao's view. Now, there's some who would want to say that that Liao, his view fails, but one of the things that he wants to say in support of his view is that it's species neutral, right? So this is supposed to be an important requirement that any account of human moral status should accommodate. So we think that when we're giving accounts of moral status, we shouldn't be speciesist. We shouldn't just privilege our species as human beings over others in an unprivileged or in unjustified ways. And so Liao says his view has the benefit, or it has the virtue of being such that it applies across the board to other species, whether we're talking about non-human animals or we're talking about, the kinds of beings that SETI would discover, aliens, okay, other rational beings, other beings that are like us, that have the genetic basis or some other kind of basis for moral agency. So it needn't be, biologically genetic. So this neutrality for Liao is enough for him to say that, look, my view has this virtue. It's not going to end up being then species. This is species neutral. So So just by way of concluding the discussion of Liao here, Liao wants to claim that that we can account for human moral status in terms of our genetic basis for moral agency. And this is had by all human beings. So he doesn't have to worry about the cases where we have those who are severely mentally disabled, who are never going to be able to actualize moral agency. They have the genetic basis nonetheless, and that's enough to account for their moral status. Moreover, he thinks that his view has neutrality across different kinds of species. So if it turns out that some non-human animals have, as part of their genome, the basis for moral agency, then they can be moral rights holders. They can have moral status. Moreover, if we were to encounter other kinds of beings that had the physical realizers, if I can put it that way, for moral agency, so it needn't be something genetic like we have, but there's some other basis for it in the abstract. You got to use your imagination here a little bit. If we were to encounter other kinds of beings that just have different physical makeups, if they have the physical basis, if I can put it that way, for moral agency, then they too would be rights holders. So Liao thinks that this is a virtue of his view, because his view, his solution to the issue of moral status, is not species chauvinistic. It's not speciesist, as sometimes it's claimed. And to be a speciesist is to privilege one species over another on unjustified grounds. Okay, so that's really the basics of Liao's view. If you have any questions or comments, please provide them below, and I'll be happy to get back with you on them. Otherwise, email me, jedickin@syr.edu. Thank you all for watching. Bye-bye.